later?
Correct. We are recording this and it will be available for anybody who wants to come back and re-listen to it.
Oh, all right, my phone is going off. Well, thanks everyone for attending. I really want to thank Judy Fassbender and Trevor Noble. I think they're going to provide some really good information for us on this current and fast-moving topic. So here's an outline of what we're trying to accomplish here today. I'm going to do an introduction and a very basic explanation of PFAS and how this affects dry cleaners and the dry cleaning cleanups. And then we're going to turn it over to Judy and Trevor to do items 1 and 2 that address concerns affecting health and the environment and some details on alternative to PFAS sampling and site investigation. So get this. Why is PFAS an issue of concern for dry cleaners? And what does this mean for dry cleaners at both open and historically closed sites? And that's a little scary if you have a closed site. But this is going to cost some money, and I think it's really important that you do this and approach this in a manner that is well thought out, so that you can be efficient in a site investigation for PFAS. What are PFAS? This is pretty surprising. Uh, PFAS are 5,000 man-made chemicals that were invented in the 1930s, brought into commercial use from the 1940s, with peak production occurring from 1970 to 2000. PFAS chemicals are useful for temperature resistance, water and oil repellent, and stain resistance such as Scotchgard and Teflon. So I think this is a slide that is part of the DNR PFAS plan that really tries to explain PFAS. This item right here is fast food packaging. So it's really everywhere in our daily environment. Some facts about PFAS. PFAS has been discovered in groundwater, surface water, and drinking water, as well as in animal and fish tissue. Ingestion is the primary pathway to enter the human body, and this is staggering. 80 or 98% of Americans have measurable levels of PFAS in their blood, so it really shows how prevalent PFAS is. PFAS substances bioaccumulate in the human body and pose a number of health risks, including developmental problems in fetuses and infants, certain types of cancers, reduced antibody response, and kidney disease. Regulation of PFAS. Judy and Trevor will go over this in greater detail, but DNR is using their legal authority to regulate PFAS under the Spills Law regarding a hazardous substance discharge on active and open sites. The goal for most dry cleaner owners and operators is to obtain NR 726 case closure and some form of finality so that they can retire or walk away from these sites. The regulation of PFAS. Why are dry cleaners who have never applied waterproofing and or stain resistant coatings a target for PFAS investigations? And I asked this of Judy, and I was so surprised, but it does make common sense. It's because PFAS chemicals on apparel, when dry cleaned, come off and are in the solvent, the distillation water, and the muck. So it is in your dry cleaning facility, whether you use the chemical or not. And often it's better known by trade names, and so you have to look at the label Regulation of PFAS. If DNR receives, this is the scary part on closed sites. So if DNR received new evidence about a closed site which indicates PFAS discharge occurred at the site prior to case closure, and the discharge was not evaluated in the site investigation, the DNR may evaluate the site under NR 727.13 criteria for reopening of closed cases. Now, this is something that DNR is very, in my experience, is very reluctant to reopen cases, but this may be more prevalent under this PFAS context. And so it's very concerning because a lot of people have closed cases, and they hope to have finality, and this is one avenue where it could be reopened. A little bit of the recent history. In 2019, Governor Tony Evers issued Executive Order number 40 to address public health risks of PFAS chemicals. And so, in my opinion, I think the state of Wisconsin is right on point on this and addressing it promptly. Although PFAS issues have been around at the federal level, several years prior. This executive order established DNR as the lead agency for a PFAS Action Council, which is comprised of other agencies and people who are knowledgeable in this area, including a number of state agencies. The PFAS Action Plan, this is perfect timing, has developed, DNR has developed a PFAS Action Plan in draft form, which is out for public comment. And there have been a number of hearings and opportunities for comment, although I think a lot of people are still coming up to speed on what this is all about. The plan was to be finalized in October, which is almost gone. And I suspect it's not going to be finalized until another month or two because people are still commenting, and we're trying to get this in final form. But I reviewed this action plan. I think it's a very good document. DNR is in the process of promulgating a number of standards that deal with PFOA and PFAS, plus now an additional 34 PFAS substances. And there are all kinds of issues here with regard to the analytical methods, what PFAS chemicals are totaled under the standard. And so there's a lot to be worked out. But standards are being developed for groundwater enforcement standards, safe drinking water standards, stormwater runoff, soil standards, even air emission standards for hazardous air contaminants, and site-specific sediment standards. So you can see how PFAS is penetrating almost every aspect of the environment at the DNR. PFAS Action Plan in mid-August 2020, DNR noticed over 3,500 responsible parties regarding currently open sites with respect to emerging contaminants. And this, in essence, was a notice letter to say, hey, if you're not aware of this, you need to be paying attention to these emerging contaminants and try to incorporate the site investigation for these contaminants into your current plans. So emerging contaminants include perchloroalkyl and perfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS, and some other contaminants that are not addressed today. So that's there may be more emerging contaminants, and certainly there are more PFAS chemicals as well. The PFAS Action Plan is in the process of promulgating groundwater standards, plus the additional 34 PFAS substances. And these standards are in the form of parts per trillion. So it's incredibly incredibly low standard. And the department, or Judy and Trevor, have a very good slide that gives you a feel for that. Um, there's safe drinking water standards, groundwater and surface water sources standards being promulgated. The WISPAC has developed a PFAS action plan in draft form, which is out for public comment. I think I'm going backwards. There we go. Um, DNR's advice is to assess emerging contaminants with their potential impacts as early in the cleanup process as possible. And I think this is good advice. From what I've been able to gather, you can't start too soon. And there's considerable savings if you do good planning. You can save considerable time and expense by planning ahead on the site investigation. Why is this so costly and time consuming? The PFAS site investigation is so different in terms of sample procedure and how PFAS chemicals travel through soil and groundwater and via air emissions that it may not fit well into the current site investigation plan. Although with proper planning, considerable savings can be realized through a coordinated site investigation plan. So there are certain activities that will be in addition to what your current plan is, but other activities that can be conducted concurrently. PFAS is so prevalent in the environment that other area sources and background concentrations may affect the site investigation. Outgradient sources, including air emission sources and stormwater runoff sources. So planning should include an evaluation of historic on-site and nearby off-site sources of PFAS used as potential sources, including historic and current storage, handling, and use of PFAS chemicals. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Judy and Trevor, and they can explain concerns affecting environment and the health. Thank you.
Thanks, Don. So I'm Judy Fossbender. I'm the Complex Projects and Technical Resources Section Chief at the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources in the Remediation and Redevelopment Program. And with me today is also Trevor Noble. Trevor, you want to introduce yourself and I'll get our slideshow up and running here.
Sure, that'd be great. Thanks, Judy. As Judy said, I'm Trevor Noble. I was taking a quick scroll down the participants list here, and I do recognize quite a few of the names. So I have the pleasure to work with the majority of you on project sites DNR related over the years, which is great. And I'm hoping that Judy and I can provide a little bit of direction and clarity when it comes to PFAS, as it's you see emerging all over it when you talk about it, and very much a platform where providing information and then receiving questions, and we essentially are learning from each other. So one thing that I wanted to say is, although I have spent the last 5.5 years with the DNR as the field operations director or the deputy bureau director for the remediation redevelopment program, I did get the majority of my career was spent on dry cleaning sites. I spent 9 years consulting and probably worked every single type of environmental case imaginable, constituent of concern besides PFAS until recently, but spent by far the majority of my time on dry cleaning sites. So I had the opportunity to inside, outside, meet the people and kind of know the name of the game as I started my career, and then where I'm at now. So with that, Judy, I think I've talked enough for an intro, and I'll hand it back to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Trevor. All right. So today there's a couple main things that we're going to talk about. The first is just a little bit of discussion to follow up on Don's introduction about emerging contaminants and how do the rules apply when we're dealing with emerging contaminants. And then we'll talk a little bit about regulatory authority and the Wisconsin Administrative Code and our 700 process as it applies to emerging contaminants. And then some discussion about standards. Don kind of introduced that, and we'll provide a little bit more information. And then Trevor's going to talk about scoping. So when you're looking at doing an investigation, what kinds of things do you need to think about when you're looking for PFAS? And then I'll wrap up with just a few case studies that show kind of what the department might recommend you consider as you're moving through with evaluating discharges on dry cleaner sites. So first off, emerging contaminants. So emerging contaminants can cause known or suspected adverse ecological or human health effects. So it's not necessarily that for certain it does, but it's suspected, and it could be something that's just an ecological effect, a human health effect, or both. And in the instance of PFAS, some of those 5,000 compounds that Don mentioned are known to cause adverse effects, and some are suspected. And a lot of information is being developed to try to confirm what those effects truly might be. With emerging contaminants, they might not have any kind of a specific numerical standard that's been established. Some media we might have, some media perhaps we don't, and we'll talk a little bit about that and what kind of standards we currently have that are established and which ones we're working on as we walk through the presentation here. Emerging contaminants include the per and polyfluoroalkyl compound list, the PFAS. They are a class of emerging contaminants, and as Don mentioned, we find them pretty much everywhere. So groundwater, soil, sediment, and surface water are very common. We find them in other biological media, fish, deer, all kinds of things like that. So they're definitely very widespread in the environment. With emerging contaminants, it's sometimes difficult to find information about them, and I have three main resources that I would recommend for you. EPA has information on their website. The Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry has some information, but my favorite is Interstate Technology and Regulatory Council, ITRC, and if you just Google ITRC, you'll find them. They have a series of fact sheets. They have a very diverse group of people who works diligently to develop new fact sheets. So as we identify areas where we have questions and concerns, their group is working to put together fact sheets. This is the best one-stop shop for starting out and finding information about what is it, what do I need to do about it, what are the risks associated with it. So again, I recommend if you're looking for information, start with that ITRC website. The link is on the page here. Oops, skipped one here. All right. DNR's authority to regulate contaminants, that kind of starts with you need an understanding of how the definitions in DNR statute and code are set up. So Wisconsin law has definitions of environmental pollution, discharge, and hazardous substance. The critical thing here is Wisconsin's rules and laws are not the same as the federal rules and laws. Especially as it pertains to how we define hazardous substance and how that changes our authority to regulate compounds. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Discharge in Wisconsin is very broad. So it means spilling, leaking, pumping, pouring, emitting, emptying, or dumping, but it's not limited to that. It could be anything else that gets some kind of constituent into the environment. So it is very broad. It can be pretty much any mechanism that you can imagine. We have authority to say, yes, if that's how a contaminant is getting into the environment, we have the authority to regulate it. Then what substances are we regulating? If you're familiar with CERCLA, they have a list of what are the hazardous substances. Wisconsin does not have such a list. We have a word descriptive version of what does it mean to be a hazardous substance in Wisconsin. And this is the entire definition, and I've highlighted a part because this is the most critical part. A hazardous substance in Wisconsin is any compound that may cause a substantial present or potential hazard to human health or the environment. This is the language that gives us that very broad authority to require that if there's been a discharge to the environment, so dumping, spilling, all those kinds of things, of any kind of a compound that may pose a substantial hazard to the environment, we have the ability to regulate that. Again, if you're looking at Superfund law, if it's not on the list, they don't have authority, which is part of the reason it's taking so long for EPA to be able to engage and help us go forward. Normally EPA sets standards and we follow right behind. In this instance, PFAS is not on the federal list of hazardous substances yet. All right, so now when you have a discharge to the environment, so if PFAS are discharged in the environment, that qualifies as a hazardous substance, and then it's regulated under 290-201 in Wisconsin statutes. That's your trigger to know that it needs to follow the NR 700 requirements to address that discharge. The NR 700 requirements are the ones that say, first of all, you need to immediately notify the state if you're aware of a discharge. Then you need to determine the appropriate, or you need to conduct a site investigation. So the first thing is to let us know. The second thing is to do that site investigation. That site investigation, the goal is to determine the nature and extent of the contamination. That site investigation and that nature and extent needs to be defined before you move forward and work with us to figure out what is the appropriate cleanup standard. And with PFAS, where we don't have standards for all media, that becomes a critical part where we'll be working together. And then the final step under 700 is to conduct that response action to restore the environment. Let's talk a little bit about the standards that we do have. So right now we have a direct contact soil standard. If you're familiar with how we develop our soil standards, we have an RCL spreadsheet, or a residual contaminant level spreadsheet that's based on EPA's RSL calculator that takes into effect what is the risk of coming into direct contact with different contaminants of concern. That RSL calculator does include PFOA and PFOS, and so we're able to use that to come up with a value in our RCL calculator that would address direct contact. We have a non-industrial direct contact standard and an industrial standard. The difference there is based on how that property is used and how much contact people are likely to have with that material. So how much time in a day. If you're at an industrial site, it's much less contact. If you're a non-industrial, like a residential property, you could have contact with that material all day long. Now, normally with soil, we have 3 levels that we look at: the 2 direct contact levels and then the groundwater protective RCL. The groundwater protective RCL is based on what is typically the NR 140 groundwater standard. And because we officially don't have an NR 140 groundwater standard yet, we do not have a set groundwater protective RCL. All right, for media where we don't have a standard, for the other media, the things like the groundwater and the surface water, sediment, any other kind of contaminated media, the NR 720-209 gives us the authority to develop a site-specific cleanup standard. And so in those instances, we take into account what is the potential for exposure, what's known about the potential health effects or the risk associated with the specific compound, and then we can work to develop a standard that will be specific to the site of interest. So it's not something that we develop once and apply to everything. It really takes in site considerations in developing a value. All right, so for groundwater, normally with groundwater, we would use a federal MCL as kind of the starting point, or the Wisconsin Administrative Code NR 140 standard. And we don't have those yet. We are in the process of developing those, and you might have heard that EPA has a cumulative health advisory level of 70 parts per trillion for PFOS and PFOA. And I will share with you, so PFOS and PFOA are just 2 of those 5,000 compounds that Don was talking about. They are the most prevalent, and they're the ones we know most about. And most of our current standards look at them as a combined. So essentially you add your PFOS value to your PFOA value and you compare it to the standard. That's how the initial concentrations have been developed. So EPA has this health advisory level. That's not necessarily a regulatory number, but they do have a value that they had developed, and now it's probably 2 years ago that they came up with that. And in that intervening time, the Wisconsin DNR has been working with the Wisconsin Department of Health Services to evaluate compounds and come up with a recommendation for how we are going to develop the NR140 groundwater standards. So our health department has recommended an enforcement standard of 20 parts per trillion and a preventive action limit of 2 parts per trillion for the PFOS and PFOA combined. Those are the values that we are pushing forward to add to the NR140 Wisconsin Administrative Code. So that is in the midst of rulemaking right now. That is a 30-month process, and we're about smack dab in the middle of it. So that will be coming out, and right now it's that's where we're headed. There are 34 other PFAS compounds that we have found in Wisconsin, and we have asked DHS to start looking for those. Now, that being said, nobody looks for the full 5,000. Nobody has even identified for certain what is that 5,000. These are the ones that we have the ability to analyze for. And so that's why those were selected above the others. And we're currently waiting for DHS to come back with recommendations on what standards might be for those. We are fully expecting that some of those 34 compounds, there is not enough information to provide a recommendation on what an NR140 standard might be. But until we get the information back from them, we're not certain. All right, I'm going to turn this over to Trevor. He is going to talk you through some of the concerns with determining nature and extent and what things you need to think about when you're scoping your investigation.
Thanks, Judy. And we'll just stick to you cycling through the slides. Might be just easier, and you'll know when to cut me off if necessary. And I think, Judy, great job. I want to just reinforce a couple of quick points, and I know a lot of the consultants on the line may have a clear understanding of this, but I use the example when we present in Marinette and Peshtigo during the public listening sessions that PFAS is, as we've mentioned multiple times, Don mentioned it, Judy mentioned it, that is a class or in a complete list of compounds. And I know there's plenty of analogies out there that PFAS is like, I think I've used hard candy, or there's tons of different types of candies that fall under the category of candy, or cookies. There's tons of different cookies, or solvents, right? Solvents, petroleum solvents, chlorinate, it's a huge list. So PFAS is a list of those thousands of compounds. I think another thing to reinforce is the regulation, which I'll mention a little bit here as we proceed through these slides under 292, and what exactly is a hazardous substance. And Judy, you mentioned you had a really good slide with the text that was taken right out of the code. Hazardous substance can be food products as well. And I know that's not what we're talking about here, primarily talking about dry cleaning solvents and PFAS, but beer, cheese, whey, turbidity, that all can fall under the category of what a hazardous substance or what a hazardous substance discharge can be to the environment. And I think a very common, it maybe just used a little interchangeably, is what a hazardous substance is, what a hazardous waste is, and what a hazardous material is. Can they all be the same? Can one be the other? Yes, but when it comes to how the state statute is written, hazardous substance. So just wanted to provide a little bit of that clarification. So the first slide here, just sampling at dry cleaning sites, and I assume we'll have quite a few questions at the end regarding this, because obviously I work with the entire team around the state, and I've seen a lot of questions come in as we've been navigating with scoping and request of sampling at dry cleaning sites. So I think this first bullet point is one of the most important. PFAS assessment process follows NR 716. NR 716, site investigation, same as any other contaminant of concern or COC that we deal with. So yes, PFAS is unique in its own way chemically and what our understanding is of the compound. Those of us that have been in the industry a while or have seen things, we haven't had something like PFAS come up. I mean, I wasn't in the industry when PCBs hit the scene, you know, but you know, just to it is the least understood of what the current contaminants that we have worked with throughout our careers. We're learning about them every day. We're navigating through them scientifically and regulatorily. So that it may be different, but as far as the process, it's still the same as what we have under NR 716 of any other contaminant of concern or constituent of concern. Emerging contaminant status requires site-specific considerations, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail in some of the subsequent slides because of, you know, as we know, certain chemicals, primarily based on the particular waste stream, behave differently in the environment, and we're still trying. And that's it, when I say we, I should probably differentiate that. I'm not saying DNR. It is a collective we as an understanding of PFAS and their compounds and how they behave in the environment. The last bullet point here, the law did not change. It's the same as what we've had. Define, degree, and extent, restore the environment to the amount practicable. And that's right out of the code. Go ahead, Judy. So planning and scoping. And so, you know, you'll see in the letters and correspondence, emails, letterhead, it'll say scoping and scoping requirements, and the code will say scoping. And essentially, you're planning. You're planning for an type of investigation. You're planning for some type of assessment. So planning and scoping. Really important thing that we're seeing on the select handful of dry cleaning sites that we do have, you know, we can talk about PFAS as a whole on the sites, but specific to the ones that are dry cleaning related historically, look at the history of the facility. You know, these are things that are identified during phase 1, phase 2. Some more information can be discovered during site investigation phases. But the history of the facility, the scale of operation is looked at, the duration of operation, the actions at the facility, and this is where we kind of go down, you know, a little bit different road, you know, because all these are kind of standard when it comes to site investigation or site assessments, but this new detail, use of waterproofing, stain resistant application. Well, that can cover a lot of things. So some of these are very, you know, maybe simple answers based on their scale or based on their history. Another one is leather treatment, same thing, and then also carpet cleaning and treatment. You know, these types of cleaning sites, they come in all shapes and sizes. And then the magnitude and extent of other contamination, and we can talk about that in a little more detail. It's another consideration that should be looked at is how bad is the existing contamination at the site. So that would, for example, that would be like a CVOC. So if it's tetrachloroethylene, if it's PCE contamination at the site. Where is the source? What does it look like? What does it look like in soil? What does it look like in groundwater? What do we currently know about the site? And that can help and aid in the PFAS investigation because of, as we know, and as we'll talk about in subsequent slides, the waste stream and all of the possible waste streams or discharge points at these dry cleaner sites. Go ahead, Judy. So a little bit of an intro on some of these slides, and I really like it. There's some pretty cool stats. So from 1950 to the year 2000, large quantities of PCE are moving through the dry cleaning industry. Solvents choice, machine efficiency, fashion trends, and there's probably folks on the call that know a heck of a lot more on the play-by-play on cost-benefit analysis and business choices when it comes to changing machines and changing solvents. And that's not from Stoddard solvent to PERC or DF2000 or something like that. You know, I know, you know, 10 years ago, there was the green machine that they were bringing in, you know, the green cleaner machine that had a certain price tag. So all of those changes that affected the amount of solvent that was used over time. Much of the materials cleaned and treated was previously treated with PFAS containing stain or other water repellent. I know Don had mentioned that in his intro that this is going back to the same thing, the type of waste stream. Where was the source? Is it more of a secondary source? Is it primary? Are you treating, is there something being treated on site with, we'll just use like a Scotch guard or some type of, is there waterproofing, stain resistance being done on, or is this I don't know, a stain resistant jacket or waterproof jacket or pants, or, you know, I knew my first pair of pants that, you know, the water, dress pants that the water would bead right up and slide right off, man, they were great. You know, are those, when they're being washed in solvent, is there PFAS materials being, you know, taken up into the solvent, into the filter cakes, into the sludge, into any other discharges? So I thought, Don, that was a great example. Because of machine technology, waste and wastewater disposal practices, some PCE and associated PFAS end up in the environment, and we'll talk about that in subsequent slides. Go ahead, Judy. So discharge mechanisms. There's some cool stats that we had got from Jim Walden. He's our vapor intrusion expert out of Madison for the DNR. A significant volume can be released from a small leak, and a 1 per second drip can release 320 gallons in 1 year. So we could probably talk stats on that till we're blue in the face here, but I thought that was pretty interesting. And I know I've worked quite a few sites where there were machines in storage that, I don't know if you could quantify a leak being that steady over time, but just to put it in perspective. Go ahead, Judy. Another frequent question that we get, and I thought it was perfect for this platform, is to understand parts per trillion. And although I've spent 15 years of my career working in environmental science and environmental contaminant geology, rarely ever worked in parts per trillion. Parts per trillion is something that, oh, Judy, got to go back or go forward one slide.
Sorry.
That's okay. We primarily work in parts per million, ppm, or parts per billion, ppb, that we see. You know, and if you want, you know, parts per million, we see a lot with soil data. Parts per billion, we see a lot with water data for our, you know, usual suspects of contaminants that we've worked with the majority of our careers. This is a little bit different. PFAS is detected in parts per trillion. So what I wanted to do is set up a couple of slides here to kind of put that in perspective. And most people have heard the 1 drop into a Olympic-sized swimming pool as being parts per billion. You know, we can go on both ends of the spectrum. What's parts per 100, parts per 1,000, parts per million, parts per billion, and parts per trillion. So as you can see here, we have parts per 100, per 1,000, per million, 2 tubs of water with 1 drop in 2 tubs of water, and then that 1 drop in an Olympic-sized swimming pool being 1 part per billion, which is typically what we see in, for instance, PCE, TCE, cis-trans, DCVC type of data. We see parts per billion. And then over here, you can see what we are looking at with PFAS is in parts per trillion. So very, very small, 1 drop in a lake. This next one I thought was cool because I put it on here because it referenced the Rose Bowl in Wisconsin, Rose Bowl. I thought it made sense. And I do know the Rose Bowl's not here. I know it's in California. But so another one, parts per million, 3 drops added to a 42-gallon barrel. Parts per billion, they use the Olympic-sized swimming pool a lot, but then this one too, parts per trillion, 10 drops added to the Rose Bowl filled with water. I've never been to the Rose Bowl. I've watched it on TV a lot. I've watched the Badgers lose there a lot, but I don't visualize the Rose Bowl full of water. So I think the next slide, Judy, is probably the best one out of the whole lot here. So there's that Olympic-sized type of swimming pool for parts per million. So the 1 pool, 1 drop, parts per billion, and this is just rough math, just to put it in perspective. But then parts per trillion being measured, it's 20 of those Olympic-sized, 1 drop in 20 of those in parts per trillion. So PPT, what we're looking at with PFAS. So now we'll go over a couple of discharge mechanisms, and these may be very familiar not only to the consultants, but to some of the industry professionals on the call today. Regarding discharges or any other types of mechanisms at these sites. Operations during previous decades may bear little resemblance to the operating room-like appearance of many current dry cleaners. So how things have changed over time. What does the story tell? Spills may have occurred anywhere within a space used at a dry cleaner. So this is not PFAS specific. This could be anything. What brings in maybe the extra little details if there was certain rooms that were used for exclusively waterproofing. So those are those little types of variables when we're paying attention to what the operations were and what those particular waste streams are. Is it in the solvent? Was it dumped out down the drain? Did they do laundry? We'll get to those slides or we'll see a couple of those examples in the next slides. Current owner may not be familiar with previous operations, and that's usually the case, as these have changed hands many times. They've sometimes changed. I've seen cleaner site. They were a cleaner site in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. Then they were something else, and then they became a cleaners again. Information obtained from interviews can also guide investigations, and we do that as far as the site history. You know, documentation has changed dramatically over time. So here, and this is, like I had said previously, not exclusive to PFAS, but to discharge mechanisms at some of these sites. Service store dumping, you know, we get figures out the back door. Sewage discharges, those can come in all shapes and sizes. Dry cleaner machine discharges, I know the locations of tanks and the delivery mechanisms of the solvent. Drain fields, no municipal system discharges. You know, I know those, we don't have too many of them, but they know exist, and we all know how septic systems can work, not only the tanks, but the drain fields when it comes to discharging hazardous substances. Holding tanks, vents, atmospheric type of discharges, and waste stream details. So as I've mentioned probably 10 times already, where did everything go? How is it managed? How is it handled? Where is it? Floor drains are a big one, and then open cinder block footings drain straight to soil. So all these factors that are typically considered in a site investigation. So here, just individually, service store, the entrance where solvent and waste entered or were stored in common location of contamination. This may also be where, you know, contact water or vents may discharge. And then sewers, this is one that does, as I said previously, comes in all shapes and sizes. There's extensive piping, there's broken piping, there's mystery piping. Where does it go? There's surface water stormwater discharges, there's sanitary discharges. So sewer disposal may have resulted in leaks from the sewer system, anywhere from the drains beneath the building to along piping runs hundreds of feet from the property. So preferential type of pathways and providing those avenues, not just the pipe itself, but potentially some of the backfill or the material that could provide essentially a like a super highway for transport. And then so machine type, and you know, I like this call out, Judy, here, because I spent a lot of my career working on hundreds of Florida dry cleaning sites. A survey performed by the FDEP found that 56% of all discharges were related to equipment maintenance and operation. Larger volume discharges were often related to solvent storage and transfer. And a couple of the sites that I did work firsthand were external off the side or the back perk tanks that had leaked either outside, or a delivery line to the machine had failed. So, and that once again goes into site history. You know, where it can be referenced from old aerials to old Sanborn maps, you know, really trying to capture that whole picture. Go ahead, Judy. So another one is the vents, and there's some cool stats here as well. When it comes to venting in the machines, and that has changed over time, obviously, with air emissions restrictions, filtration systems, even human health changes to the exposures for the owners and operators. So the first two generations of dry cleaning machines were vented, vents found on the roof or out the back wall. A lot of those are still visible to today on a lot of the old cleaners. So in the stat here, at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, vented air contained 26,000 parts per million perk off a machine. In climates like Wisconsin, much PCE would have condensed when it hit the cold outside air. So what did it do? How far did it go? Did it drop out quickly because of that change in temperature? PCE in soil and groundwater found in millions of parts per billion beneath the vents. And then vent points of release is often overlooked during investigations, and not that it's completely overlooked, and I've done it many years ago firsthand, you know, on the priorities, but I think it's another you know, a consideration for what we're looking for here is a robust scoping or site investigation. Has it been considered? Has that avenue been discovered? So where the dry cleaning operation is gone and the building has been repurposed, we have quite a few sites that are like this, where it's long gone. You can't even see. I've been in plenty of sites where you can just see the bolts, where the machine used to sit, or some of the bolts where some of the presses were, or something like that. So what's the history of the site? Location of building features was explain contaminant distribution. Like I've said a couple of times now, it doesn't change because it's PFAS, but taking into consideration features like doors, access drains, sewer laterals, foundations, element vents, stuff we would typically look for in an SI. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the use of Sanborn maps and building records to really do that deep dive on trying to make the case for site history. So here, and my last slide here, requirements for scoping and planning statement and documentation, with the realization that all of these sites that we work they're all in different spots. They're at the beginning, they're near the finish line. They're huge sites, they're small sites. They all come in different shapes and sizes with tons and tons of site-specific variables. But I think communication is the key. So a couple of key points here: history of operation, information on services provided, assessment of existing contamination, and then records. So these are kind of the key things that we've seen as we've been navigating through scoping statements and planning and receiving data, kind of at the core foundational things that we look for. And I had added a couple more details here to what types of records, because based on site history and what can be requested or what is still available, manifest, disposal documentation, order documentation, inventory documentation, SDSs or MSDSs based on the information, and with the realization that quite a few of the documentation, if it is manifest, disposal, ordering, inventory, or even the SDSs, don't specifically call out per and polyfluoroalkyl substances or fluorinated compounds on their SDSs. Some of them do, but you will see certain things like proprietary surfactants or proprietary water, some type of compound like that. They can kind of give you an idea, okay, maybe we should look into something that, maybe they had 50 orders of this proprietary, of water, whatever the case may be, but just something else to consider. And with that, I will turn it over to Judy with some real life case studies that we are currently working within the DNR.
Thanks, Trevor. So I just want to pick up here where Trevor left off and just let folks know. So we do see that dry cleaners very commonly have PFAS as part of a discharge, especially if they've got some kind of a release that was a spent solvent, we're finding PFAS. And so as we're trying to make decisions and work with you to figure out, do you need to sample for PFAS or not? This list that Trevor has on this slide is the kind of information that we want you to provide. So that helps us figure out, do you have reason enough for us requesting that you move forward with adding PFAS to your site investigation planning. And again, most dry cleaners, we are asking for PFAS to be assessed just because of the frequency at which PFAS is found when there's been a used solvent discharge. On that note, then I will move to some case studies, and I'm just going to kind of speed through some things, but I want to share what we look at, and probably more importantly, how we would, in order to expedite what's happening, we'd recommend that you move forward if you have a site that's similar to one of these, or just get some ideas here. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is a site where there's some concern about private well impacts. So this is an industrial dry cleaning facility. It's been in operation since 1993. On the website, it listed what services they provide. And there's a few things here that really call out for us. The water repel, the Scotch Guard, those kinds of things are typically PFAS type compounds. Not necessarily if they're doing that today, because there's been some changes in which materials include the PFAS compounds. But if it started in 1993, that's recent enough or far enough back enough, I guess, so that PFAS would be something that we would anticipate evaluating here. Looking at the sources of where the discharge that we're evaluating, and this was it's a PCE discharge, the dry cleaning machines, a spray room, and then a probable failed containment area under the dry cleaning facility were all areas that we're looking at as potential for the source of the PCE that has been found in groundwater. Other things that we look at here is, so now the definition of the extent is ongoing. So they've chased the plume to the edge of the property, and it's clear that there needs to be further definition beyond the plume. This is a site that has 4 feet of soil fill, sand and clay, but then it's underlain by sand and gravels. And so right away, this is likely one, once any kind of contaminant hits groundwater, it's going to move pretty fast. And the residential properties are not too far away, 1,400 feet. And if you're dealing with sand and gravel, depending on how much contaminant has been discharged, might be an issue. And then beyond that is the surface water. In this instance, it's Silver Lake, about a half mile from the site, so not too far. And we are very cautious from the state's perspective of where there are discharges of potential PFAS compounds into groundwater. An initial round of sampling was collected. This is kind of a site overview, and you don't really need to be able to see this. I'm going to tell you what it says. So essentially the yellow circles are where PFAS samples were collected. The red and blue lines are kind of dashed at the front end here. There's the groundwater flow is off to the northwest. The sample to the northwest had the highest levels of PFAS. And if we add, again, we're going to add the PFOA to the PFOS. And that comes up to be about 10 times the proposed standard. And so that's what you can't see here is the numbers, but know that this is an order of magnitude above the regulatory level that we're looking at, and is currently being promulgated for the NR 140 standard. This is kind of an aerial view here with the lake over here, and all these little pins represent private wells. Again, 1,400 feet or thereabout from the facility here to the first private well. Normally what we're seeing people do is they define their whole extent on what is the chlorinated solvent plume, and then they come back and start looking for PFAS. And truly, we want to encourage you, collect some samples near the source area of PFAS right from the beginning, so you know if you should be including that in your assessment going forward, rather than doing a full investigation for one set of compounds, those chlorinateds, and then coming back and you have to kind of redo everything for the next. So that's my message here. I think just for folks to be aware, we're not just looking at what's happening on the property when we're looking at PFAS. These are compounds that tend to move very quickly in the environment. And so then right away, as soon as we know that it's there, we're looking to say, what do we need to worry about? And can we get some Century Well kind of monitoring happening to find out if it's going to be an issue or not? So that's the first case study that I wanted to share. The next one is something that we see pretty commonly, where you've got a small urban operation. This one operated for 37 years. Trevor mentioned that we've seen properties that they were something and then something else and then went back to the other thing. This one, the building was constructed in 1950, but the records of what it was between 1950 and 1982 are not anything that's been shared with us. They did discover contamination in 2006. The sources that they identified were dry cleaning machines, some drums that had no secondary containment, and then noted spills that they experienced from when they were moving the drums of the PCE around on the property. This one is similar to what we find quite a bit in southeast Wisconsin with our till, where there's, again, soil fill, sand and clay underlain by silty clay. So probably not going to move quite as fast as the sand in the other example, but still something that we're looking at. This one is in an area that's serviced by a municipal well that gets its water from Lake Michigan. So we're not concerned necessarily about that part. But again, we've got PCE has not been sampled yet here, but they've already kind of defined what their extent is. And so they have pretty high levels of PCE out here. But there's no indication of what kind of PFAS might be present. And so this is one where when you've got that investigation complete, the typical ask that we would have is look at your wells that have the highest impact, look at the sources of where you might have had a discharge of PFAS, and then put forward a work plan for proposing to look for PFAS compounds once you confirm that in fact it is there. But we're working with you to try to expedite how quickly you can get to the finish line. It's tough when you hit one finish line and we ask you to go back and start the race over again. And so we're trying to avoid that as much as possible, get the word out, include PFAS from the beginning. One more thing, I'll share one more example. And this is one where it seems that the discharge came from a sewer line. And we're seeing more and more of this as we look at current and former dry cleaner properties where even the operation at the facility might have been great, but at some point it discharged into a sewer line and that sewer line leaks. And so then there's a discharge from that sewer line. So here the sources could potentially have been the dry cleaning machines. More likely it was that leaky sewer lateral. So I want to just show you this one, and it's a little bit hard to see, but essentially the dry cleaner was in the strip mall over here on the left side of the figure. The plume has already been defined pretty well, and it's a long, narrow plume. This is based on the geology, looks like it's some kind of a sand and gravel channel. The PCE impacts are defined to the north and south of this long, narrow plume. But now we're looking at PFAS, and 3 samples of PFAS were collected, and those are those yellow dots, and they were found in all 3. And so now we're looking at, let's go back and get some additional definition to figure out what is the nature and extent of PFAS. Again, as much as we can streamline, that's the recommendation. We don't really want you to go out and do one investigation to define your extent of chlorinated solvents, and then we come and say, and now go back and do it again. If you include PFAS right off the bat, figure out if it's there or not. If it's not there, you're done. If it is there, then you know that to just include it in your scoping for the next steps. All right, so just kind of in summary, we talked about emerging contaminants and our recommendation to include assessment of emerging contaminants right from the start of investigation. Look at your history of your building, as Trevor talked about, include it in the scoping. Do one investigation for multiple compounds rather than trying to do these in stages. We talked a little bit about our regulatory authority and how we're looking at site-specific standards. Trevor walked through the scoping things to consider, truly looking at how are you going to define extent and take those necessary actions. And then that scoping statement documentation, that information you're going to provide for us that says this is what the likely source might have been, or perhaps there's no reason to indicate there would be a source and you've got reasons as to why it wouldn't have been there. That's what we're looking for. All right, and that's all the information that we had to share. So Mike, we can turn it back to you, or if people have questions.
Yeah, so thank you, Trevor, Judy, and Don for that great presentation. With that, I would like to open it up for any questions to anybody on the call. Just feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question.
Judy, and it looks like, Mike, we have one from Adam Roeder at Sigma that came on the chat here.
Yep.
You want me to read it, Mike? I can just read it.
Sure, you can read it if you want.
Yeah, sure. And this is a great question, Adam. Please comment on what you are seeing at dry cleaner sites for IDW, investigation-derived waste, after PFAS testing has been completed. Judy, do you want to take it, or do you want me to comment on at least what we've heard?
You take it, I'll add.
Sure. So, Adam, or for the whole group, these have come in all shapes and sizes, and what I visualize here is your 55-gallon drum of purge water that has been characterized for disposal. And I know we haven't received much disposal documentation yet from these types of sites, from dry cleaner sites specifically, because they're either still staged or we just started getting data in. So the examples that we do have, because we are so very early on in sites completing or submitting data for these sites, either the drums are still on site, the water is still being staged. The couple of sites where there has been disposal, they have disposed of it out of state. So it is gone. I know some has gone down to Illinois, some has went out to Oregon, some has been sent to Michigan, and I believe Ohio. But I don't believe any landfills in the state of Wisconsin are accepting PFAS contaminated waste at this time. But that's not a DNR. That is a industry, landfill specific requirement. It looks like there's a question here, a really good next question here. What is the role of DERF and where is it financially standing? And that is an excellent question. Judy, do you want to tackle that one?
I do. Hold on a minute here because I'm going to just share a different set of information.
And I assume everyone on the call knows what DERF is, unless we want to explain it out, Mike. We may not with
I would
this
think
audience.
Everyone on would know what it is.
Okay.
All right, so it's the Dry Cleaner Environmental Response Program. And at this point, if you were eligible and signed up by a certain time, there was an opportunity to get some financial support for remediation related to dry cleaner sites. It's been closed to new participants for quite a while, several years. And I just want to share a little bit of information on the financial standing. So essentially there's just over 200 sites that were eligible for DERF, or actually this is are eligible. About half of them have reached closure. There's about 3% or 7 sites that signed up for it, but did not have a report a discharge. And then there's about half the sites, a little over 100 sites, are still working their way through the closure process. There is a communication that DERF eligible folks are going to, if they haven't received it today, they likely will receive it in the next couple of days. It was supposed to go out yesterday. Just to give people kind of an update on where we are with funding, and I'm going to share a little bit of information here. And this information is available on our website, not necessarily in this format, but I think you can see at one point in time back in 1999 and 2000 when the fund was initially established, it brought in close to $1.4 million. And this is the fund is based on fees that are paid by dry cleaners on the products that they purchase for the dry cleaning work that they do. And you can see over time, this has been dropping off significantly to the point now where the revenue that gets generated through the taxes that are paid is about $450,000. And that's annually. And then two things that I want to share is we were at about a 9 or 10% decline in revenue just because changes in the industry, and more so because changes more so in how the industry does the dry cleaning action, so that they're not using the more environmentally concerning substances. So there's less tax being generated that way, but also because of how people are purchasing things that need to be dry cleaned. There's less purchase of clothing and related things that require that dry cleaning. So here we're doing a projection. If we see the 10% decline, which is what we had seen before, we're looking at a significant drop off. And this DERF is set up to run through 2032, but it's right now it doesn't have funds to reimburse the claims. We have the rest of the funding that we're likely going to receive from through 2032 will be used to pay claims in-house. So when we look at what's the role of DERF, at this point, we're looking for ways that we might be able to get DERF some more money. We're also, though, looking at, is there a broader tool that we might be able to develop, one that doesn't require that you be a DERF eligible applicant, that if you are associated with a dry cleaning industry, you would be eligible to get some support, because this one was had that limited membership. You had to be eligible at a certain time, sign up by a certain time, and essentially the door is closed.
So we did get one more question that has come in. In urban settings, we may find PFAS from a variety of sources. Any particular PFAS compounds more likely seen as residues of waterproofing chemicals to help differentiate sources?
So, Roger, I love this question. This is excellent, and I started giving it some thought as Judy was just talking. And you know, I think I have quite a bit to say about it, but it's not going to go very deep. You know, this is something as a scientist that I think we're all very passionate about, is getting the data and making those connections. And where we are with PFAS is we're just starting to get in enough data to start making those types of connections. And just recently, we've been having some discussions internally because of the amount of data that we're getting to start seeing those things. And because there is a varied list and the data is varied over time, not only on detection limits, but how many PFAS compounds were analyzed for. So it's not only its analytical method, but it's also what type of industry, which is what we're bringing up here. So I think preliminarily, we are seeing from some of our sites where AFFF, so firefighting foams, were used. We're seeing a relationship in certain carboxylic and sulfonic acids that are associated with PFAS. You know, we're seeing those particular types of PFAS compounds, and they're matching up. So I think the amount of data that we have specific to dry cleaning sites, we just don't have enough yet. And I think it may be variable because of the, as I mentioned, the waste streams and what type of PFAS compounds and the age at which they were applied, because these compounds have changed over time. Heavier end C8, PFOA, PFOS, heavy compounds, and as they've changed or gotten phased out, depending on what the industry or what the use is, and being replaced with some of these other compounds, you can see that. And I think the important point here is how to differentiate in urban settings, and Judy and I talk about that a lot. As we're discovering more data and as we have people looking at this, there is an understanding that based on the current data that we have, that is rather limited, that this is going to pop up and we are going to see it in other places. And what connections can we make? And I think one of the common questions that we get from consultants on many other constituents of interest is, how much is enough, or is this plume mine, or to what end? And I think that's something with the PFAS that we're still navigating through. We're still discovering it because we do have just that limited amount of data. Judy, anything to add to that?
I would add that a year ago, there was not much in the way of any kind of a fingerprinting library. And just in the past couple months, there's been a lot of work toward people developing that fingerprinting library. Exactly this. I looked at dry cleaners. This is what I found based on a timeline of this discharge. Looked at electroplaters. Here's this kind of a signature that we would find in what we've got. There is a lot of information on firefighting foam, as Trevor mentioned. In part, that's because it's coming from the military. They have done a lot of research because they're one of the biggest users of the firefighting foam and training and with their equipment. So it started from there, and we're seeing significant improvement in what's available to be able to look at it and say, truly can we do fingerprinting to identify what the likely source of this mixture is?
And I think, yes, exactly, Judy. And, you know, I think based on, I probably am saying it too much, the data that we do have to date, you know, kind of as I've been saying, and I should probably come up with a new line because I use it with PAHs, the usual suspects, what we're seeing on a lot of these sites, you know, PFBA, PFHXA, PHXS, and PFO and PFOS, you know, so what does it mean right now? I just don't think we, and that's a collective we, have enough data to make those connections, but it's something that we're very eager for.
Any last minute questions here? Doesn't look like it. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for being in attendance today. Thank Trevor and Judy from the Wisconsin DNR and Don Gallo from Axley Bryan Nelson for their great presentation on PFAS. Again, this webinar was recorded, so if you guys need to go back and take a look at it for any purposes, please reach out to us at info@wiscleaners.com, and we can get you a link to that. So thank you everyone for in attendance, and thank you to everybody.
So, and Blaine, if you're still on, this is my coworker, because I'm like, really, I don't have a coworker. I gotta have one. Working from home is getting pretty old.
It's a good way to end, Judy.
Yep. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
So thank you.